My name is Iris Montgomery, and for the longest time, I believed that my biggest flaw was simply existing in the wrong places, especially after I met the family of my ex-fiancé, Dominic. I want you to understand something before I go any further. This isn't a story about a poor girl who fell in love with a rich boy. It's more complicated than that. It's about the invisible lines people draw around themselves, the walls they build with smiles and polite words, and how sometimes the person you love most can stand on the other side of that wall, watching you struggle to climb over and do absolutely nothing to help you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. I met Dominic on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of day where the sunlight comes through the windows at just the right angle, making everything look softer, more forgiving. I was working at Hartwell's Books and Paper in downtown Riverside, a small independent shop that smelled like vanilla and old pages and fresh ink, like possibility itself had a scent. I'd been there for 3 years, working my way up from stock clerk to senior sales associate. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every paycheck I earned, I carefully divided into envelopes: rent, groceries, savings, and the most important one, education. I was putting myself through business courses at the community college, one class at a time, building towards something bigger, something that felt like it belonged to me alone. My apartment was a studio on the 3rd floor of an old building where the radiator clanked at night, and the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's television through the plaster. But it was mine. I'd painted the walls myself, a soft cream color that made the space feel bigger than it was. I'd furnished it with secondhand finds from thrift stores and estate sales, mixing and matching until it felt like home. There was a small kitchen where I learned to cook cheap meals that would stretch across multiple days, a bathroom with tiles that were cracked but clean, and a single window that looked out over the street below, where I'd sit in the mornings with my coffee, watching the city wake up. I was proud of that apartment, proud of every single thing I'd earned and bought and built there. It represented 3 years of careful budgeting, of saying no to things I wanted so I could afford the things I needed. It represented independence, self-sufficiency, the knowledge that I could take care of myself without anyone's help. My mother had raised me alone after my father left when I was 6. She'd worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at night, to keep us afloat. She'd taught me that dignity wasn't about what you had, but about how you carried yourself, about working hard and being honest and never asking for handouts. She'd died when I was 20, a heart attack that came without warning, and I'd been on my own ever since. Sometimes I wondered what she'd think of the life I'd built, whether she'd be proud of the apartment, the job, the classes, the careful way I managed every dollar. I hoped she would be. Dominic walked in that day looking for a specific edition of a rare book for his father's birthday. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the kind that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, and he had this slightly lost expression that I found endearing. Wealthy people often looked like that in our shop, like they'd accidentally wandered into a foreign country where they didn't speak the language, where the customs were unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable. I approached him with my usual greeting, asking if I could help him find something specific. He looked relieved, explaining that he needed a first edition of The Great Gatsby for his father's 60th birthday. His father was a collector, he told me, someone who appreciated the history and craftsmanship of beautiful books. There was something in the way he talked about his father, a mixture of respect and distance, like he was describing someone he admired but didn't quite know. I told him we might have what he was looking for and led him to our rare book section, a small alcove at the back of the shop where we kept the valuable editions under glass. As I pulled out the keys, I explained the different printings, the significance of dust jackets, the way certain flaws could actually increase value because they proved authenticity. He listened intently, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested, not just being polite. We found what he needed, a 1925 first edition in remarkably good condition. When I told him the price, he didn't even flinch, just pulled out his wallet. But before he paid, he asked me about the book itself, whether I'd read it, what I thought of it. I told him I had, that it was one of my favorites, that there was something about Fitzgerald's ability to capture longing that had always stayed with me. The way he wrote about wanting something just out of reach, about building your entire life around a dream that might be nothing but an illusion. Dominic smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes, and told me he understood exactly what I meant. He said he'd always identified with Gatsby himself, with the idea of reinventing yourself, of becoming someone new. I remember thinking that was strange. Why would someone who seemed to have everything want to be anyone other than who he already was? Before he left, he asked for my number. Just like that, simple and direct, with a confidence that suggested he wasn't used to being turned down. I hesitated for a moment, my practical side warning me that this was a bad idea, that we were from different worlds, that nothing good could come from it. But there was something about his smile, about the way he'd listened to me talk about books like my opinions actually mattered, that made me say yes. He called me that same evening, not a text, but an actual phone call, which felt almost old-fashioned. He asked if I'd like to have dinner with him that Friday, if I knew anywhere good, somewhere I liked. I suggested a small Italian restaurant near my apartment, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, where the pasta was homemade and the owner knew half the customers by name. He agreed without hesitation, and when Friday came, he picked me up right on time. I should have known then. I should have seen the signs, but he had kind eyes, the color of warm amber in sunlight, and when he smiled at me, I felt like I was the only person in the world who mattered, like I'd been invisible my entire life and he'd finally made me real. We started dating, and for 6 months, it was perfect. He took me to restaurants I could never afford, places with cloth napkins and wine lists longer than books, introduced me to art galleries where paintings cost more than cars, took me to wine tastings where people discussed notes and legs like they were analyzing Shakespeare. He taught me things about his world that fascinated, opened doors I'd never even known existed. But more than that, he seemed genuinely interested in mine. He wanted to know about my childhood, my dreams, my night classes. He'd pick me up after work and we'd drive to the lake, sitting in his car for hours just talking about everything and nothing, about who we were and who we wanted to become. Those first months felt like living in a dream. Dominic would show up at the bookshop during my lunch breaks with sandwiches from a deli 3 blocks away, the expensive kind with imported cheeses and artisan bread. We'd sit in the small break room, eating and talking, and he'd ask me about the customers I'd helped that morning, genuinely interested in the stories I'd tell about the elderly woman looking for a childhood favorite or the young man searching for the perfect proposal book. He introduced me to his friends gradually, casually. We'd meet them for drinks at upscale bars where a single cocktail cost what I usually spent on groceries for a week. His friends were polite, friendly even, asking me questions about my work and my studies. I could tell they found it charming, almost quaint, that I worked in a bookshop and went to community college. They'd exchange glances when I mentioned things like my night classes or my studio apartment, subtle looks that I pretended not to notice, but Dominic never seemed embarrassed. At least not then. He'd hold my hand under the table, his thumb drawing circles on my palm, and when I'd talk about my business courses or my plans for the future, he'd lean in close, showing everyone that he was listening, that what I said mattered to him. He took me to a contemporary art museum one Saturday afternoon, and I remember standing in front of a massive abstract painting, all bold colors and chaotic brushstrokes, trying to understand what I was supposed to see. Dominic explained the artist's technique, the historical context, the way the piece challenged traditional notions of beauty. He didn't talk down to me or make me feel stupid for not knowing. Instead, he seemed excited to share this part of his world, to watch me discover things for the first time. We went to a wine tasting at a vineyard outside the city, and I was completely lost among the discussions of tannins and bouquets and finishes. But Dominic stayed by my side the entire time, whispering explanation, making me laugh with his commentary about the pretentious way some people swirled their glasses. He made me feel like we were in on a joke together, like his world was something we were exploring as partners rather than something he already belonged to and I was visiting. There were small moments that should have warned me, red flags I was too happy to notice, like the time he suggested I might want to try wearing my hair down more often instead of in the ponytail I usually wore to work, or when he bought me a dress for a dinner with his colleagues, something more expensive than anything I owned, telling me it would photograph well, or the way he'd changed the subject when his mother called while we were together, stepping away to take the call in private. But I was in love. And when you're in love, especially for the first time, you have this incredible ability to overlook the small warning sign, to rationalize away the tiny moments of doubt. You tell yourself you're being paranoid, overly sensitive, that you're looking for problems where none exist. He made me feel seen. That's a powerful thing, feeling seen by someone, especially when you've spent most of your life feeling invisible, like you're walking through the world as a ghost that no one quite notices, that no one quite remembers. Dominic proposed to me on a Sunday morning in April. We were having breakfast at this tiny cafe I loved, the kind with mismatched chairs and homemade jam and coffee that came in chipped ceramic mugs, and he just pulled out the ring right there between the coffee cups and toast crumbs. It wasn't a grand gesture, no orchestra, no crowd, no photographer waiting to capture the moment for social media. It was simple and perfect and us, and I thought maybe that meant we'd always be simple and perfect and us. The ring was beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, set in white gold. He told me he'd chosen a sapphire instead of a diamond because it reminded him of my eyes, of the dress I'd worn on our first date. He said he'd been carrying it around for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment, and then realized the perfect moment was just a regular Sunday morning in the place where we'd had our first date. I said yes without hesitation, without doubt, without any idea of what that yes would cost me. The other customers in the cafe applauded, and the owner brought us complimentary champagne, and for those few minutes, The world felt absolutely right. I remember looking at the ring on my finger, watching how it caught the light, thinking about how I'd describe this moment to my future children, to my future grandchildren. This was the story I'd tell about how their grandfather proposed, about the beginning of our forever. We spent the rest of that day walking through the city, holding hands, making plans. Dominic talked about a small wedding, something intimate, just close friends and family. I talked about maybe having it in the fall, when the leaves were changing. We stopped at a park and sat on a bench, watching families with their children, dogs chasing frisbees, couples walking hand in hand like we were. Everything felt possible. But that evening, when Dominic dropped me off at my apartment, I noticed a change in his demeanor. He was quieter, more distant, checking his phone more frequently. When I asked if everything was okay, he smiled and kissed my forehead, telling me everything was perfect, that he just had some work things on his mind. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking at the ring on my finger, watching how the streetlight through my window made the sapphire glow. I thought about what it meant to be engaged, to be promising forever to someone, to be building a life together. I thought about meeting his family, about eventually having children, about growing old together. I thought about all the wonderful, terrifying possibilities that stretched out before us. I had no idea that in exactly 1 week, everything would change. And that's when everything changed. Meeting his family was something Dominic had been carefully avoiding, I realized later. He'd introduced me to his friends, to his colleagues, to distant relatives at casual gatherings, but his immediate family, his mother Celeste, his father Julian, his sister Vivian, they'd been kept at a careful distance, like paintings behind velvet ropes that you could admire but never touch. He told me they were busy, that the timing wasn't right, that we'd do it soon. I didn't push. I was so happy just being with him that I didn't notice the pattern until the engagement ring was on my finger. And suddenly, meeting the family became inevitable, like a storm you could see gathering on the horizon but couldn't outrun. The invitation came exactly 1 week after the proposal. Celeste Whitmore, Dominic's mother, called him directly. I was sitting next to him on the couch when his phone rang, and I watched his entire body tense up the moment he saw her name on the screen. He answered with a careful formality that I'd never heard him use before, his voice shifting into something cooler, more measured, like he was putting on armor made of politeness and distance. When he hung up, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He told me his family was hosting a charity gala at their estate that Saturday evening, and that his mother specifically requested my presence. He said it casually, like it was no big deal, but I saw the way his jaw tightened, saw the muscle working beneath his skin. I heard the unspoken warning in his tone, the words he wasn't saying layered beneath the words he was. I asked him what I should expect, trying to keep my voice light, trying to pretend my heart wasn't suddenly racing. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Then he squeezed my hand and told me not to worry. He said they'd love me, but the way he said it felt more like a prayer than a promise, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. That entire week, I thought about nothing else. The gala consumed my thoughts during every waking moment. What do you wear to meet a family like the Whitmores? They owned Whitmore Medical Holdings, a network of private hospitals and research facilities that stretched across 3 states. They were featured in magazines, attended by politicians and celebrities. Julian Whitmore had been profiled in Forbes twice. I'd Googled him after Dominic first told me his last name. Sitting in my apartment late at night, scrolling through images of this distinguished man with silver hair and sharp eyes, standing beside presidents and senators and CEOs. Celeste chaired multiple charity boards and was photographed at every major social event in the city, always in gowns that looked like they cost more than most people's cars, always perfectly composed, always surrounded by other perfectly composed people. And I was a girl who worked in a bookshop, who split her tips jar money between groceries and textbooks, who considered it a luxury to buy name-brand coffee instead of the store brand. I spent my lunch breaks that week searching through boutiques I normally walked past without even glancing at the window displays. I'd walk in, trying to look like I belonged, and immediately feel the sales assistants, eyes on me, assessing, judging, deciding whether I was worth their time. At some stores, they'd approach with practiced smiles, showing me dresses that cost 2 months of my rent. At others, they'd barely acknowledge my presence, letting me browse alone, a clear message that I wasn't their target customer. Everything was so expensive. I watched the numbers climb on the price tags and felt my stomach drop with each one. $800 for a simple cocktail dress, $1,200 for something with beading, $1,500 for a gown that didn't even look that special to my untrained eye. I felt my dream of finishing college slipping further away with every dress I touched, calculating in my head how many classes each dress represented, how many textbooks, how many months of careful saving. I tried on dresses that made me feel like a child playing dress-up, drowning in fabric and expectations I couldn't afford. I tried on dresses that fit perfectly but cost more than my entire emergency fund. I tried on dresses that I loved but knew I could never justify purchasing, not when that money could go toward finishing my degree, toward building my future. The sales assistants could sense my hesitation, my internal calculation. At one boutique, a woman with perfectly manicured nails and an expression of barely concealed impatience told me that perhaps I should look at their more accessible sister brand downtown. The way she said accessible made it clear what she really meant. Cheaper, for people like you, for people who don't belong here. I left that store fighting back tears, humiliation burning in my chest. Finally, on Thursday, I found something within my reach, a dress on the sale rack at the back of a department store. It was elegant, simple, a deep midnight blue that made my eyes look brighter, made me feel like maybe I could belong in their world. The fabric felt good against my skin, not as luxurious as the dresses at the front of the store, but respectable, appropriate, good enough, I hoped. The original price had been $600, marked down to $250 because of a small tear in the hem that I could barely see, that I could fix with a few careful stitches. It was still more than I'd ever spent on a single piece of clothing, still more than I'd budgeted for, but it was the best I could do. I bought it with money I'd been saving for next semester's textbooks, and I tried not to think about what that meant. Tried not to calculate how many extra shifts I'd need to pick up to replace what I'd just spent, how many nights I'd spend eating ramen instead of real meals to make up the difference. I took the dress home and spent an hour carefully repairing the hem, my mother's old sewing kit open on my lap, remembering how she'd taught me to make small repairs to extend the life of our clothes. If you take care of things, she'd always said, they'll take care of you. I wondered what she'd think of this dress, of this situation, of me spending grocery money to impress people who'd probably never noticed the difference between my $250 dress and their $2,000 one. The next few days, I practiced. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I did. I practiced walking in the heels I'd borrowed from my coworker, practiced sitting gracefully, practiced the polite small talk I imagined I'd need to make. I watched YouTube videos on posture, on how to hold a champagne glass, on proper dinner etiquette. I researched recent charity events and medical industry news so I'd have something to talk about if anyone asked me questions. I was preparing for this gala the way other people prepare for job interview or final, like my entire future depended on making the right impression, on saying the right on being the right and maybe it. When Saturday evening arrived, I spent 2 hours getting ready. I watched YouTube tutorials on elegant updos, practiced my makeup 3 times, changed my jewelry 4 times. Dominic picked me up at 6, and when he saw me, he smiled and told me I looked beautiful. But he didn't say I looked perfect. And somehow, in that small omission, I heard everything I needed to know. The Whitmore estate was exactly what I'd imagined, and somehow worse. It wasn't just a house. It was a statement of power and permanence. A sprawling property with manicured gardens that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd studied at Versailles. Every hedge trimmed to geometric perfection, every flower bed coordinated like a symphony. The main building was all stone and glass, with columns that stretched up to the 2nd floor, and windows that glowed like amber in the evening light, warm and inviting from the outside, though I'd soon learn the warmth was only an illusion. There were sculptures in the garden, actual sculptures, not garden gnomes or bird baths, but massive modern art pieces that probably cost more than my entire apartment building, abstract forms that seemed to watch us as we approached. Cars were lined up along the circular driveway, each one shinier and more expensive than the last. Valets in crisp uniforms moved between them efficiently, handling keys like they were accustomed to vehicles that cost 6 figures. As we pulled up, I saw women in gowns that looked like they'd walked off a runway, men in tuxedos that fit like second skin, everyone moving with that easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. I suddenly felt like my carefully chosen dress was made of newspaper. Dominic must have sensed my panic because he reached over and took my hand. He told me to breathe, told me I belonged there just as much as anyone else, told me he loved me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. We walked through the massive front doors into a foyer that could have swallowed my entire apartment. There was a grand staircase that curved upward like something from a movie, crystal chandeliers that scattered light across marble floors so polished they reflected everything like still water. Staff members moved through the space carrying trays of champagne and crystal flutes, offering them to guests with practiced smiles that never quite reached their eyes. And that's when I saw her, Celeste Whitmore. She was standing near the entrance to the main ballroom, holding court with a group of women who all looked like they'd stepped out of the same magazine spread, all perfect hair and perfect makeup and perfect posture. She wore a cream-colored gown that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, and diamonds at her throat that caught the light with every movement, throwing tiny rainbows across her skin. Her hair was pulled back in an impossibly elegant twist, and her makeup was so subtle and perfect it looked like she wasn't wearing any at all. like she'd simply woken up looking that flawless. When she saw Dominic, her face lit up with genuine warmth, a transformation so complete it was almost startling. She excused herself from her group and glided toward us, and I mean glided, because women like Celeste Whitmore don't simply walk. They float, they drift, they command space just by moving through it. She embraced Dominic, kissing him on both cheeks in that way that wealthy people do, that continental affectation that marked you as part of their world, then turned her attention to me. I'll never forget that moment. Her eyes moved over me from head to toe in one smooth, assessing sweep. It took maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds, I felt completely exposed, like she'd cataloged every thread of my dress, every imperfection in my makeup, every sign that I didn't belong in her world, every penny I'd struggled to save written across my skin in invisible ink that only she could read. Then she smiled. It was a beautiful smile, warm and welcoming, the kind that reached her eyes and created tiny lines at the corners. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was genuinely delighted to meet me, thrilled that her son had found someone who made him happy. But I knew better. She took my hands in hers, her skin cool and smooth like porcelain, and told me how wonderful it was to finally meet me. She said Dominic had told her so much about me, though I knew for a fact he'd barely mentioned me at all, had kept me as separate from his family as possible. Then she stepped back slightly, maintaining that perfect smile, and looked at my dress with an expression I couldn't quite read. She told me, in a voice like honey poured over glass, that my dress was absolutely charming. She said it reminded her of the uniforms her administrative staff wore at the main hospital. Simple, elegant, practical. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush hot, felt my throat tighten, felt every person in the foyer suddenly looking at me, judging me, finding me wanting. Dominic's hand tightened on my waist, but he said nothing. He just stood there, smiling that same polite smile, and said nothing at all, as if his mother hadn't just compared my carefully chosen dress to a staff uniform, as if she hadn't just told everyone within earshot that I looked like the help. Celeste continued talking, already moving on to other topics, introducing me to the women she'd been speaking with earlier. They all smiled and nodded and said the appropriate thing, murmuring polite greeting, but I could see it in their eyes too. That same quick assessment, that same calculation of my worth, that same conclusion, not enough. I was being weighed and measured, and I was coming up short. The evening only got worse from there, each moment building on the last like a slow-motion car crash that I couldn't escape. We moved into the ballroom, where round tables were set up around the edges and a small orchestra played in the corner. Something classical and elegant that I didn't recognize. Everything was elegant. Everything was perfect. Everything was designed to make you feel like you'd stepped into a world of grace and beauty, of effortless sophistication, unless you didn't belong there. Then it was designed to make you feel exactly how out of place you were, to highlight every flaw, every mistake, every sign that you were an imposter in their carefully curated world. The ballroom itself was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the garden, now lit with thousands of tiny lights that made the whole scene look like something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, each one probably worth more than everything I owned combined. The tables were covered in cream-colored linen, set with china and crystal and silver that gleamed under the lights. Massive flower arrangement, roses and orchids and flowers I couldn't even name, served as centerpieces, their perfume heavy in the air. Waitstaff circulated with trays of canapes and champagne, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. I watched them work, noticed how they made eye contact with some guests and carefully avoided it with others, how they knew instinctively who was important and who wasn't, who deserved their attention and who they could ignore. People kept approaching Dominic, pulling him into conversations about business mergers and social connections and people I'd never heard of, names that seemed to mean something to everyone but me. I stood beside him, smiling and nodding, trying to follow along, trying to contribute when I could, but increasingly, I noticed that people would look at me with confusion, like they couldn't quite figure out who I was or why I was there, like I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere in their picture. A woman with diamonds at her throat asked Dominic about some mutual acquaintance, someone named Philip who was apparently expanding into the Asian markets. Dominic launched into a discussion about international medical regulations and corporate structures, and I stood there, my smile frozen on my face, understanding maybe one word in 10. The woman's eyes kept flickering to me, clearly wondering who I was and why I wasn't contributing to the conversation. When there was a pause, I tried to ask an intelligent question about how international expansion affected patient care. Genuinely curious, trying to engage, the woman looked at me like I'd just asked what color the sky was, then explained in slow, simple words, the kind you'd use with a child, that patient care wasn't really the primary consideration in corporate expansion, that I probably wouldn't understand the complexities involved. I felt my face burn with embarrassment, felt Dominic's hand tighten on my waist in what might have been support or might have been a warning to stay quiet. More than once, someone asked me, in that casually assumptive way, which department I worked in at Whitmore Medical Holding. The first time it happened, I was standing near the bar, waiting while Dominic spoke with a colleague. A man in his 50s, with gray hair and an expensive watch, approached me with a friendly smile. He asked if I worked in the pediatric wing or in administration, telling me he recognized my face but couldn't quite place it. I politely corrected him, explaining that I wasn't employed by the family, that I was actually engaged to Dominic. I held up my hand, showing him the ring, trying to make it real, trying to claim my place. The man looked at the ring, then at me, then at the ring again, his expression shifting through confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like pity. He asked what I did do, his tone making it clear he expected something impressive, something worthy of a Whitmore's attention. I told him I worked at Hartwell's Books and Paper, trying to sound proud of it, trying to make it sound like it mattered. The way he said, "oh," told me everything I needed to know. It was such a small word, just 2 letters, but he managed to pack it full of disappointment and dismissal and a sudden loss of interest. He quickly excused himself, claiming he needed to find his wife, and I watched him walk away, watched him join another group of people and lean in close, undoubtedly sharing what he'd just learned. After that, I started just vaguely smiling and changing the subject when people asked about my connection to the family. It was easier than watching their faces shift from polite interest to thinly veiled confusion. Easier than seeing the moment they decided I wasn't worth their time, that I wasn't interesting enough to merit conversation. Dominic introduced me to several of his friends throughout the evening, always with the same phrase, "This is Iris, my fiancée." He'd say it proudly enough, but I started noticing that he never added any details about me, never mentioned what I did or where we'd met, or anything that might spark actual conversation. It was like he was hoping people would be satisfied with just knowing I existed, wouldn't ask any follow-up questions. His friends were kind enough, surface-level kind, the way people are at parties when they're making small talk and don't want to seem rude, but also don't want to invest too much energy. They'd shake my hand, smile, tell me it was nice to meet me, and then immediately turn back to Dominic to discuss things I couldn't follow, couldn't contribute to, couldn't even pretend to understand. At one point, a young man around Dominic's age, someone named Preston who'd gone to boarding school with him, asked me where I'd gone to school. His tone casual, but his eyes sharp, assessing. When I mentioned the community college, adding that I was working on my business degree, he nodded slowly and told me he admired people who took the practical route, who were realistic about their limitations. He said it like he was complimenting a child for trying their best at a hopeless task, like he was patting me on the head for knowing my place, for not reaching above my station. Then he turned to Dominic and asked about someone named Bradley who was apparently at Harvard Business School, making it very clear what he thought of my community college education in comparison. I excused myself to the restroom shortly after that, needing a moment alone to breathe, to compose myself, to remember who I was before I'd walked into this place that seemed designed to make me forget, to make me question everything I'd ever accomplished. The bathroom was, predictably, more beautiful than my entire apartment. All marble and gold fixtures and fresh flowers in crystal vases, towels that felt like clouds, soap that probably cost more per pump than my entire bottle at home. There was a sitting area with a velvet couch and a full-length mirror surrounded by perfect lighting. Everything smelled like expensive perfume and luxury. I stood at the sink, gripping the cool stone, and stared at my reflection. I could see everything wrong with me now, all the ways I didn't measure up. My makeup, which had looked pretty in my apartment mirror, now seemed too much, trying too hard. My dress, which had felt elegant when I put it on, now looked exactly like what it was. A sale rack purchase, a budget approximation of what everyone else was wearing. My hair, which I'd spent an hour styling, was already starting to come loose, small strands escaping the carefully constructed updo. I looked tired. I looked small. I looked exactly like someone wearing a sale rack dress to a gala where everyone else had personal stylists and unlimited budgets and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove your worth, from always knowing you belong. I splashed cold water on my wrists, trying to calm down, trying to remember that I was the same person I'd been that morning, that these people's opinions didn't change who I actually was. But it was hard to believe that when everything around me seemed designed to prove otherwise. I gave myself a moment, took several deep breaths, reminded myself that I only had to make it through a few more hours. Then I could go home, take off this dress, and forget this entire evening ever happened. Dominic and I would figure this out. Maybe his family just needed time to get to know me. Maybe this was just first meeting awkwardness. Maybe everything would get better. I heard the door open behind me and quickly composed myself, straightening my spine, fixing my smile, turning to see who it was. It was Vivienne, Dominic's sister. I'd met her briefly when we first arrived, a quick introduction that consisted of air kisses and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that looked practiced and perfect and completely empty. She was younger than Dominic by 2 years, stunning in a way that seemed effortless, with their mother's elegant bone structure and their father's sharp intelligence in her gaze, everything about her polished to a high shine. She wore a silver dress that probably cost more than my rent for a year, her hair pulled back in a sleek chignon, her makeup so perfect it looked airbrushed. Diamonds glittered at her ears and throat, catching the light with every movement. She looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, like she'd been born knowing how to navigate rooms like this, how to exist in spaces where everything cost more than most people made in a month. She moved to the mirror beside me, pulling out a lipstick from her small clutch. One of those expensive brands I'd seen in magazines but never imagined owning. She didn't acknowledge me at first, just carefully applied the color, pressed her lips together, examined herself from multiple angles, taking her time like I wasn't even there, like I was part of the furniture, something to be ignored. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I didn't know if I should say something, try to make conversation, or just leave. My instinct was to leave, to escape this bathroom and this woman who was making me feel invisible just by ignoring me. But something kept me rooted in place, some perverse need to see what would happen, to understand what she was thinking. Then she spoke, her voice casual, like she was commenting on the weather or the quality of the champagne. She told me she thought it was sweet that Dominic had found someone so down to earth. The pause before down to earth was deliberate, calculated, making it clear that wasn't the word she actually wanted to use. She said her brother had always had a thing for projects, for fixing things, for helping people, like he was a mechanic and I was a broken-down car he'd found on the side of the road. The word projects hung in the air between us like poison gas. I felt something twist in my chest, anger and hurt mixing into something sharp and painful, something that made it hard to breathe. But I kept my face neutral, kept my voice steady. I asked her what she meant by that, though I already knew, could already feel the answer settling into my bones like ice. She finally looked at me directly, her expression unreadable, her eyes cold despite the perfect makeup. She set down her lipstick with deliberate care, turned to face me fully, and I realized this wasn't a casual comment. This was planned. She'd followed me in here specifically to have this conversation, to deliver whatever message she'd decided I needed to hear. She told me not to take it the wrong way, her tone suggesting that there was absolutely a wrong way to take it, and I was currently taking it. She said Dominic genuinely cared about me. She could see that. Could see it in the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching. But she wanted me to understand that their family had certain expectations, certain standards that had been maintained for generations, bloodlines and legacies and traditions that mattered more than love. She explained, in that careful, condescending way, that the Whitmores weren't just a family, they were an institution. They'd built their medical empire over 3 generations, carefully cultivating relationships with other prominent families, maintaining standards of excellence and prestige. Marriage, she told me, wasn't just about love for people like them. It was about strategy, about building alliances, about ensuring that the next generation could maintain what previous generations had built. She said it wasn't personal, it was just how their world worked, as if that made it better, as if systemic exclusion was somehow less cruel than personal rejection, as if the fact that they'd reject anyone in my position made it hurt less. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me that she'd seen this before, with other girls who'd caught Dominic's attention. He had a pattern, she explained, of dating women who were different from what his family expected, women who represented something outside their world, but it never lasted. Eventually, he always came back to where he belonged, to people who understood his responsibilities, his position, his future. She made me sound disposable, temporary, like a phase he was going through, like a rebellious haircut he'd eventually grow out of. Then she smiled, that same smile I'd seen on her mother's face earlier, beautiful and cold as marble, and told me she hoped I'd enjoy the rest of the evening. She picked up her lipstick, dropped it back in her clutch, and swept out of the bathroom, leaving me standing there with my hands shaking and my heart racing. She left before I could respond, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel, like a verdict being delivered, guilty of being insufficient, of being the wrong kind of person, of daring to believe I could belong somewhere I clearly didn't. I stood there alone, my hands shaking, tears burning behind my eyes, threatening to spill over and ruin the makeup I'd so carefully applied, the armor I'd so carefully constructed. I stood there alone, my hands shaking, tears burning behind my eyes, threatening to spill over and ruin the makeup I'd so carefully applied. I wanted to leave, I wanted to walk out of that beautiful bathroom, out of that perfect house, out of that entire world and never look back. Never think about these people again. Never subject myself to their casual cruelty disguised as concern, to their systemic dismissal of anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. But I didn't, because some part of me, the stubborn part, the part that had worked 2 jobs to pay for community college, the part that had rebuilt my life after my mother died, refused to let them see me break, refused to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to me, that their words had landed, that they'd successfully put me in what they considered my place. I took a deep breath, fixed my makeup with shaking hands, put on my smile like armor, and walked back out to the party, because I loved Dominic, and I thought that maybe, somehow, love would be enough to bridge the gap between our worlds. I thought that maybe if I just held on, if I just proved myself worthy, if I just showed them I could learn, could adapt, could become whatever they needed me to be, then eventually they'd accept me. I had no idea how wrong I was. I had no idea that trying to become acceptable to people who had already decided you weren't would require erasing everything that made you yourself. The worst moment came near the end of the evening, and it's the moment that finally broke through whatever denial I'd been living in, whatever fantasy I'd constructed about making this work. I was standing near one of the tall windows, watching the garden lights twinkle in the darkness like captured stars, when I heard voices nearby. 2 women were talking, their backs to me, apparently unaware that I was within earshot, or perhaps not caring if I heard, confident that someone like me didn't matter enough to worry about, that my feelings were inconsequential. One of them was Vivian. The other was one of her friends, someone I'd been briefly introduced to earlier in the evening but whose name I couldn't remember. All of them blending together into one perfect, polished mass of designer dresses and dismissive smiles. They were discussing the engagement, and I froze, my entire body going still as I strained to hear, pressing myself against the wall like I could become part of it, invisible and forgotten. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything else. Vivian's friend was saying something about how surprising the news had been, how no one had expected Dominic to propose to someone so different. The pause before the word different was loaded with meaning, heavy with judgment, with all the things she wasn't saying out loud but that I could hear perfectly clearly anyway. Then Vivian responded, her voice carrying clearly across the space between us. Designed to carry, I realized later, designed for me to hear. This wasn't an accidental conversation I'd stumbled upon. This was deliberate, calculated, meant to deliver a message. She told her friend that I seemed nice enough, hardworking certainly, clearly trying my best, the kind of girl who meant well but would never quite understand. She said I was polite, appropriately grateful for Dominic's attention, properly aware of the opportunity I was being given. But she said, and I will never forget these exact words, they're burned into my memory like a brand, seared into my consciousness forever, that Dominic had always had a taste for the simple things in life. She said it like it was a character flaw, something endearing but ultimately concerning, like he collected stray cats or had a fondness for cheap wine, like his attraction to me was a quirk that needed correcting rather than a genuine connection. Simple. That word hit me harder than anything else that evening, harder than the comment about my dress, harder than the assumption that I worked for the family, harder than Vivian's bathroom speech about projects and expectations. Not kind, not genuine, not intelligent, not loving, not determined, not hardworking, not any of the things I actually was, any of the things I'd spent my entire life trying to be. Simple. Like I was some plain, uncomplicated thing he'd picked up at a thrift store, charming in its simplicity but ultimately not valuable enough to keep, not worth the investment of time or money or introduction to the family, not worth defending, not worth fighting for. I stood there, frozen, as they continued their conversation, each word landing like a physical blow. They discussed whether the engagement would actually lead to marriage, whether Dominic would come to his senses, whether I would fit in to their social circle, and what would happen when I inevitably failed all their unspoken tests. Vivian's friend asked what Celeste thought, and Vivian laughed, actually laughed, and said her mother was convinced this was just Dominic's way of rebelling, of pushing back against family expectations one last time before settling down properly. She said Celeste was being patient, giving him space to get this out of his system, confident that eventually he'd realize what he was risking for someone, so she paused again, searching for the right word. Unsuitable. Unsuitable. Another word to add to my collection. Simple. Different. A project. Unsuitable. They talked about me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome, a phase Dominic needed to grow out of, like acne or a rebellious haircut, something embarrassing that would eventually be forgotten, that would one day be a funny story they'd tell at dinner parties. Remember when Dominic was engaged to that girl who worked in a bookshop? Vivian's friend asked how long she thought it would last, and Vivian considered for a moment before answering. She said she gave it 6 months, maybe a year at most. Dominic would start to see the differences, she explained, the fundamental incompatibilities. He'd realize that love wasn't enough when you couldn't share the same social circles, couldn't attend events without worrying about saying the wrong thing, couldn't introduce your partner to your professional contacts without embarrassment. She said all of this with such certainty, such casual confidence, like my relationship was a mathematical equation she'd already solved, like my future had already been written, and all I could do was wait for it to play out according to her predictions. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to them dissect my worth and find it wanting, calculate my value and declare me bankrupt. It could have been minutes or hours. Time felt strained, distorted by the pain that was spreading through my chest like poison, like ice, like something that was killing me from the inside out. Eventually, they moved away, their laughter fading into the general noise of the party, light and carefree, unburdened by the damage they'd just done. I remained by the window, my reflection staring back at me in the dark glass. I looked like a ghost, pale and insubstantial, barely there, fading even as I watched. The drive home was silent. Dominic tried to make conversation, asking me if I'd enjoyed the evening, telling me his parents had been impressed with me, saying the night had gone well, that I'd done great, that everything was perfect, but I couldn't speak. Every time I tried to form words, I felt that tightness in my throat return, felt the tears threatening to spill over, felt myself breaking apart into pieces that I didn't know how to put back together. He must have noticed my silence because eventually he stopped talking too. He just drove, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set in that way it got when he was stressed, when he knew something was wrong but didn't want to acknowledge it. When we pulled up outside my apartment building, he turned to me, his expression concerned, his hand reaching for mine. He asked if I was okay, if something had happened, if someone had said something to upset me. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to pour out all the small cruelties, all the subtle humiliation, all the ways I'd been made to feel small and worthless throughout the evening, all the ways his family had taken me apart piece by piece. But more than anything, I wanted him to already know. I wanted him to have noticed, to have defended me, to have stood up and said something, anything, to protect me from his family's judgment, to show me that I mattered more to him than their approval. Instead, he'd stood beside me, silent and complicit, while they picked me apart like vultures on a corpse. I told him I was just tired, exhausted from the evening. I thanked him for the evening, my voice flat and distant. I kissed him quickly on the cheek and got out of the car before he could say anything else, before he could see me fall apart. I made it into my apartment, closed the door, locked it, slid down to the floor with my back against it, the cool wood the only thing keeping me upright, and then I cried. I cried for the girl who'd spent her grocery money on a dress that wasn't good enough, that would never be good enough no matter how much it cost. I cried for the girl who'd been called simple like it was a diagnosis, like it was a disease with no cure. I cried for the girl who'd realized that the man she loved was too weak to defend her from his own family, too concerned with keeping the peace to risk making waves. But mostly, I cried because I knew, with a certainty that felt like drowning, that I would never be accepted by them, not as I was, not as myself. And I couldn't figure out if the problem was that they couldn't see my worth, or that Dominic had never really seen it either, had loved an idea of me that existed only in his head, separate from his real life. That night changed everything for me, though I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't immediately break up with Dominic. I wish I could say I had that kind of strength, that clarity of purpose, that I stood up and walked away with my head held high. But I was 24 years old, in love for the first time, and terrified of being alone, of going back to being invisible after he'd made me feel so seen. So I stayed. We continued our relationship, but something fundamental had shifted, like a bone that had been broken and would never quite heal right. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before, things I'd been too in love to see. The way Dominic would subtly steer conversations away from my job when we were with his friends, how he'd suggest changes to my appearance in gentle, careful ways, asking if I'd ever thought about wearing my hair differently or trying a different style of clothing. The fact that he never invited me to family dinners or events unless absolutely necessary, keeping me separate from his real life, his real world. He was embarrassed by me. He loved me, maybe, in his way. But he was embarrassed by where I came from, by what I did, by who I was. And the worst part? I started trying to change myself to fit his world. I picked up extra shifts at the shop to save money for better clothes, spending my lunch breaks browsing boutiques I still couldn't afford, memorizing what the wealthy women wore so I could approximate it on my budget. I studied etiquette guides online, watching videos about proper table settings and which fork to use when and how to make small talk about art and wine and things I'd never experienced. I practiced conversation topics that would be appropriate for his social circle, rehearsing stories that made me sound more interesting, more cultured, more worthy. I straightened my hair, changed my makeup, altered my speech patterns, smoothing out the rough edges of my accent, eliminating slang, making myself smaller and quieter and less. I was systematically erasing myself, trying to become someone who would be acceptable to the Whitmores, someone they could tolerate at their perfect table. It took me 3 more months to realize what I was doing. 3 months of slowly disappearing into the background of my own life, becoming a ghost in my own skin. The moment of clarity came, strangely enough, at work. A young girl came into the shop one afternoon, maybe 17 or 18, looking for supplies for art school. She was so excited, practically vibrating with enthusiasm, showing me her portfolio, talking about her dreams of becoming an illustrator, about the things she wanted to create. She had this light in her eyes, this absolute certainty about who she was and what she wanted, this unshakable confidence that the world would make space for her because she deserved space. I helped her find everything she needed, gathering sketchbooks and charcoals and watercolors, and as she left, she turned back and thanked me. She told me I'd been really helpful, really kind, that she appreciated how I'd listened to her and understood what she was looking for, how I'd treated her dreams like they mattered. It was such a small thing, a simple thank you from a customer, but it made me realize that I'd stopped hearing those words from Dominic. He'd stopped seeing me, really seeing me, somewhere along the way. Or maybe he never had. Maybe I'd been so desperate to be seen that I'd mistaken his attention for understanding, his curiosity for acceptance. That evening, I sat in my apartment and made a list. On one side, I wrote down everything I loved about myself, my work ethic, my determination, my ability to connect with people, my dreams for the future, my resilience, my kindness, my intelligence, that had nothing to do with which school I'd attended. On the other side, I wrote down everything Dominic's family had made me feel: inadequate, simple, wrong, out of place, not enough, like a problem that needed solving, like a phase that needed ending. I stared at those 2 columns for hours, the words blurring together as the sun set and my apartment fell into darkness. And then I made a decision. I broke up with Dominic on a Sunday morning, exactly 8 months after he'd proposed. We met at the same cafe where he'd asked me to marry him, and I gave him back his ring across the same table where I'd said yes, where I'd thought my life was beginning when it was actually ending, or maybe the other way around. He was shocked. He kept asking me why, what had changed, what he'd done wrong, his voice rising, his face flushing, like this was something that had happened to him rather than something we'd both participated in. He told me he loved me, that we could work through whatever was bothering me, that his family would come around eventually, that I just needed to give them time, but I knew better now. I explained to him, as calmly as I could, that I couldn't keep trying to become someone else to fit into his world, that I was tired of shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold me. I told him that I deserved someone who was proud of me exactly as I was, someone who would stand beside me instead of slightly ahead, blocking me from view, using me as a shield against his own dissatisfaction while keeping me hidden from anything that mattered. I told him that I'd spent months making myself smaller, quieter, less, and that I'd finally realized I was worth more than that. He tried to argue, tried to tell me I was wrong, that he'd never asked me to change, his voice taking on that edge of frustration I'd heard a few times before, when I wasn't performing correctly. But I just shook my head and told him that some things don't need to be asked. Sometimes the silence says everything. Sometimes what you don't defend speaks louder than what you do. He took the ring, staring at it like he couldn't quite believe this was happening, like I was being unreasonable, like I was throwing away something precious. I stood up to leave, gathering my purse, preparing to walk out of his life forever. As I reached the door, he called out to me one last time. He told me I'd regret this, that I'd realize I was throwing away something good, something real, that I'd never find anyone who could give me what he had given me. I turned back and looked at him one last time. This beautiful, weak man who'd loved me but hadn't loved me enough, who'd seen me but hadn't really looked, who'd promised me everything but delivered nothing. I told him maybe I would regret it, but I'd regret staying even more. And then I walked out into the sunlight, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The months after the breakup were harder than I'd expected. Not because I missed Dominic, though I did, sometimes in the quiet moments. Missing not him exactly, but the idea of him, the promise of what we could have been if he'd been stronger, if I'd been different, if the world had worked some other way. But because I'd built so much of my identity around that relationship, around trying to be worthy of his world, around becoming someone who could stand next to him without embarrassment. Without it, I had to figure out who I actually was, underneath all the changes I'd made, underneath all the performances I'd given. I threw myself into my work at the shop and my classes at the community college. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my relationship, people who'd known me before Dominic, who remembered who I was when I was just Iris, not Iris, trying to be good enough for the Whitmores. I started saying yes to opportunities I would have turned down before, too afraid they weren't prestigious enough, too worried they wouldn't impress the people I no longer needed to impress. I learned to value myself again, slowly, piece by piece, rebuilding the person I'd almost completely dismantled. And something unexpected happened. The business courses I'd been taking all those years started to coalesce into something real, something tangible. I'd been learning about management, marketing, customer relations, inventory systems, all while working at Hartwell's, all while watching how the shop operated, seeing opportunities that no one else seemed to see. I started noticing things, ways to expand our online presence, product lines we could carry that would attract a different demographic, services we could offer that would set us apart from the corporate chain. I started seeing the shop not as a place I worked, but as a business with potential, with possibilities, with room to grow. 6 months after the breakup, I pitched my ideas to Mr. Hartwell, the shop's owner. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd been running the shop for 30 years, but was starting to think about retirement, starting to wonder what would happen to his life's work when he was gone. He loved my ideas. More than that, he saw something in me I'd almost forgotten was there. Ambition, vision, the kind of determination that builds something from nothing. He offered me a partnership. It took me 2 years, countless late nights, and every bit of knowledge I'd gained from those community college courses. But we transformed that small bookshop into something special. We expanded our inventory, launched an online store, started offering custom design services and rare book sourcing. We became known for quality and personal service, for understanding what readers needed before they knew themselves. Business grew. My partnership stake grew. My confidence grew. And then, exactly 3 years after I'd walked out of that cafe, something happened that I never could have predicted. I was at a downtown business mixer, networking for the shop, wearing a suit I'd bought with my own money and feeling proud of it, when I saw him, Dominic. He looked the same, older, maybe, a bit more worn around the edges, lines appearing near his eyes that hadn't been there before, but still handsome in that carefully cultivated way. He was standing with a group of men in expensive suits, holding a whiskey and laughing at something someone had said, playing the part he'd been raised to play. He saw me at the same moment I saw him, and the shock on his face was visible even from across the room, his mouth falling open slightly, his eyes widening. I could have left. I could have slipped out before he made his way over, avoided the awkwardness, pretended I hadn't seen him, but I didn't want to. I'd spent years building myself back up from the girl who'd cried on her apartment floor, from the girl who'd thought her world was ending. I'd built a business, earned a reputation, found genuine confidence in who I was and what I'd accomplished. I wasn't afraid of him anymore, or of his family, or of that world that had once made me feel so small, so I stayed. He excused himself from his group and walked over to me, his expression uncertain, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. He said my name like a question, like he wasn't sure I was real, like maybe I was a ghost he'd conjured. We made small talk for a few minutes, careful, polite conversation about what we'd been doing, how life had treated us, the weather, anything but what actually mattered, dancing around the elephant in the room. Then he asked me if I wanted to get coffee sometime, to really catch up, his eyes hopeful in a way that made me sad for him. I considered it for a moment. Part of me was curious. Part of me wanted to see what he'd become, whether he'd changed, whether he'd grown, whether he'd learned anything from what happened between us. But I realized I didn't need to know. I'd already moved on. I'd already built a life that had nothing to do with him or his approval, a life that belonged entirely to me. So I told him, kindly but firmly, that I didn't think that was a good idea. I wished him well, genuinely, hoping he'd found whatever it was he'd been looking for, and then I excused myself to continue networking. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there. I'd faced the person who'd once made me question my entire worth, and I'd realized he had no power over me anymore. None at all. But that's not actually where this story ends, because fate, it turns out, has a sense of irony that borders on cruelty or comedy, depending on your perspective. 2 months after that business mixer, Mr. Hartwell informed me that he was ready to retire fully. He wanted to sell me his remaining stake in the shop, make me the sole owner, give me complete control of the business we'd built together. It was a huge opportunity, the kind that changes your entire life, but it required capital I didn't have. I needed a business loan, a significant one, and that meant meetings with banks, presentations to investors, all the things that would test everything I'd built, everything I'd learned, everything I'd become. One of those meetings was with Riverside Capital Group, a major investment firm that specialized in small business development. I prepared for weeks. I refined my pitch, assembled my portfolio, practiced my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep, until every word was perfect, every number memorized. This was my chance to take full ownership of something I'd built from almost nothing, and I wasn't going to waste it. The day of the meeting, I walked into Riverside Capital's downtown office wearing a suit I'd bought with my own money, carrying a briefcase full of projections and business plans, holding my head high, feeling like I could conquer the world. The receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 15th floor. She told me Mr. Whitmore would be with me shortly. I froze. Whitmore. It couldn't be. It had to be a coincidence. It was a common enough name, wasn't it? Maybe it was a different Whitmore. Someone completely unrelated. Someone who wouldn't look at me and see all my failures reflected back. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew. When the door opened and Julian Whitmore walked in, Dominic's father, I felt like I'd been transported back to that terrible evening 3 years ago, felt every humiliation come flooding back. He looked exactly the same, distinguished, powerful, completely in control of every room he entered, commanding attention without saying a word. He stopped when he saw me, recognition flashing across his face, his eyebrows rising slightly. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with unspoken history. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, not the polite, dismissive one I'd seen at the gala, but something that looked almost like respect, and extended his hand. He told me it was good to see me again, that he'd heard good things about Hartwell's books and paper, that he'd done his research before the meeting and had been impressed by what he'd found. He said he was very interested to hear my pitch, his tone professional and genuinely curious. I could have panicked. 3 years ago, I would have stammered and apologized and made myself small, would have sabotaged myself before he even had the chance to reject me, but I wasn't that girl anymore. I shook his hand firmly, met his eyes without flinching, and told him I was ready to show him exactly what my business could do, exactly what I'd built from the ground up. For the next hour, I presented everything I'd built, every number, every strategy, every projection. I answered his questions with confidence, backed up my claims with data, demonstrated not just passion but expertise, not just dreams, but concrete plans for growth. I showed him market analysis, customer demographics, profit margins, expansion possibilities. I made it clear that I wasn't asking for charity. I was offering an opportunity to invest in something real, something solid, something that would generate returns. I watched his expression shift as I talked. From polite interest to genuine engagement to something that looked almost like respect, maybe even admiration. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and regarded me for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. Then he told me something I never expected to hear. He said that when Dominic had brought me to that gala 3 years ago, he'd seen potential in, not the kind of potential his wife and daughter saw, someone to be molded into their image, someone to be fixed and corrected, but real potential, someone with drive, with intelligence, with the kind of determination that built empires from nothing. He told me he'd watched me that evening, watched how I'd handled their casual cruelties, how I'd held my head high even when they tried to break me down. He told me he'd actually been disappointed when he heard about our breakup, though he'd understood why it happened. He'd watched his son let me go without fighting for me, and he'd realized Dominic had inherited his mother's inability to see value in anything that didn't come pre-packaged with the right pedigree, the right credentials, the right connection. He said he'd made mistakes too, staying silent at that gala, letting his wife and daughter make me feel unwelcome, standing by while they dissected me piece by piece. He'd thought at the time that if I really belonged in their world, I'd find a way to claim my place, would fight back, would prove myself worthy. But he'd realized since then that he should have spoken up, should have seen what it was doing to his son to force him to choose between love and approval, should have recognized that some of the most valuable things in life don't come with pedigrees. Then he leaned forward, his expression serious, and told me he wanted to invest in my business, not just approve my loan, but become a personal investor, put his own money and his own reputation behind what I was building. He said he saw what I'd built, and he wanted to be part of where it was going. I didn't know what to say. This man, who 3 years ago had watched his family tear me apart without saying a word, was now offering to bet on my success, to believe in me when his own son hadn't. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to walk out with my head held high and find funding somewhere else, anywhere else, to prove that I didn't need anything from the Whitmores, that I could succeed entirely on my own. But I'd learned something important in those 3 years. Accepting help wasn't the same as accepting charity, and sometimes the sweetest victory isn't refusing every connection to your past, but transforming those connections into something new, something that belongs to you. So I accepted his investment offer. We shook hands, signed preliminary paperwork, and scheduled follow-up meetings. It was professional, cordial, the beginning of a business relationship that had nothing to do with his son or my past or anything except mutual respect and the promise of profit. As I was leaving, he stopped me at the door. He told me that Dominic had asked about me a few weeks ago, had mentioned running into me at a business mixer, said he'd been thinking about me, wondering if maybe he'd made a mistake letting me go. Then he told me, and I could hear something like regret in his voice, something almost like an apology, that he'd advised Dominic not to reach out. He said some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. Not out of cruelty, but because both people had grown into new shapes that no longer fit together. Because the person you were and the person you've become are sometimes fundamentally incompatible with the person someone else remembers and wants back. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant, grateful for his honesty. As I rode the elevator down, clutching my briefcase and the investment papers inside it, I thought about that girl who'd stood in a bathroom at a gala 3 years ago, listening to herself being called simple like it was a diagnosis, like it was a death sentence. That girl had thought her world was ending. She'd had no idea it was actually just beginning. Today, I own Hartwell's Books and Paper outright. We've expanded to 3 locations across the city, employ 15 people who I treat with the respect I once craved, and have an online presence that reaches across the country. I still teach myself new things every day, still take courses when I can, still find joy in helping customers find exactly what they need, in matching people with books that will change their lives. Julian Whitmore did become one of my investors, and over time, we've developed a respectful professional relationship built on results and mutual benefit. Nothing more. He occasionally asks about whether I'd be open to reconnecting with Dominic, testing the waters, and I always give him the same answer. Some chapters close for a reason. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Dominic eventually married someone from his mother's social circle, someone who checked all the right boxes, who fit perfectly into their world. I hope he's happy. I genuinely do. I hope he found whatever it was he was looking for. Hope that it brings him more peace than I ever could have. As for me, I'm building something entirely my own. I date when I feel like it. Invest in my education, spend time with friends who value me for who I am, and make decisions based on my dreams, not someone else's expectations or someone else's definition of success. I still think about that night at the gala sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because those people who made me feel small, who called me simple, who looked at me and saw only what I lacked, they gave me something precious without meaning to. They gave me clarity. They showed me that I had a choice. I could spend my life trying to fit into spaces that would never quite accept me, or I could build my own space, one where I decided the rules, where I determined what mattered, where I defined success on my own terms. I chose the latter. And sometimes, late at night when I'm closing up the shop, locking the doors and turning off the lights, I think about that girl standing by the window at the Whitmore estate, listening to her worth being calculated and found wanting. I wish I could tell her that none of it mattered, that the opinion of people who measured value in pedigrees and bank accounts was meaningless in the face of her own determination. I wish I could tell her that she wasn't simple at all. She was strong in ways those people would never understand, possessed a resilience they'd never needed to develop, because everything had always been given to them. I wish I could tell her that the pain she was feeling, the humiliation and hurt and crushing inadequacy, was planting seeds that would eventually bloom into something powerful, something entirely her own. But most of all, I wish I could tell her this. You're going to be just fine, better than fine. You're going to build something beautiful from all this pain. And one day you'll look back and realize that the worst night of your life was actually the beginning of your best one. Because sometimes, being told you don't belong is the universe's way of showing you that you were never meant to fit into their story. You were always meant to write your own. And your story, Iris, is going to be extraordinary.